A ruthless billionaire, known for running his empire with fear and control, secretly orders a deadly trap inside his mansion's private elevator, aiming to punish the quiet maid who had gained his son's trust and unknowingly uncovered dark secrets from his past. But just as everything is set in motion, his emotionally distant child begins to notice strange behavior, overhears a chilling conversation late at night, and suddenly realizes that something terrible is about to happen to the only person who's ever shown him real affection. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Richard Coleman was a billionaire who made his fortune in the real estate industry. He lived alone in an enormous mansion surrounded by expensive furniture, paintings, and decorations that showed his wealth. But despite all the luxury, the house was always quiet, and there was no laughter or joy. Richard had no close friends and didn't allow people to get too close. Every part of his life was carefully planned, and every detail in his house was arranged exactly the way he wanted. His company was huge and powerful, but it wasn't built honestly. Richard used corruption and blackmail to grow his business. He paid off officials, manipulated contracts, and used people's secrets to control them. Even with this dark past, his image in public was perfect. He smiled for cameras, donated money to charities, and pretended to be a man of honor. No one outside his circle knew the truth about how he had really built his empire, and that's exactly how he wanted it. Inside the mansion, fear controlled everything. The workers, maids, drivers, gardeners, cooks, did their jobs quickly and quietly. They were afraid of making mistakes because Richard could explode in anger without warning. He wasn't the kind of boss who forgave errors. Even a small problem could lead to someone being fired. People whispered about his coldness and how nothing seemed to touch his heart. Everyone in the house followed strict schedules, and every room had cameras to make sure no one disobeyed him. His power reached every corner of the building, and nobody dared to relax. The silence in the house was heavy. You could feel that something was wrong, but no one dared to say it. It wasn't just the fear of losing their jobs, it was something deeper. Richard didn't just control their work, he controlled their lives. He demanded loyalty, but gave nothing back. He expected obedience, but offered no respect. He ruled the mansion like a dictator, and no one felt truly safe there. In this huge house lived a boy named Ethan. He was around 10 years old, quiet and shy. Ethan was not Richard's biological son, but Richard treated him like an heir. However, that didn't mean love or kindness. Ethan rarely got hugs or heard kind words. Most of the time, Richard ignored him completely. The boy lived surrounded by expensive toys, video games, and books, but none of these things could replace the affection he never received. He had a large room with everything a child could want, except warmth. The nannies came and went, never staying long, and none were allowed to get too close. Richard didn't want Ethan to grow up soft. He believed showing emotions was a weakness, so Ethan learned to keep his feelings inside. He became afraid to speak too much or ask for attention. He walked through the hallways like a ghost, unnoticed. The silence that filled the house also filled his heart, and slowly, Ethan stopped trying to be seen. Richard believed that control was the most important thing in the world. He controlled his business, his employees, and his home. Nothing happened without his permission. If someone betrayed him or disappointed him, he made sure they paid the price. In business, he crushed his enemies. He bought their companies, exposed their secrets, or destroyed their reputations. He didn't care who got hurt, as long as he stayed on top. He thought this made him strong. He didn't believe in trust or friendship. In his eyes, everyone had a price or a weakness. He only respected power, and he had worked his whole life to make sure no one could challenge his. At home, he acted the same way. Every meal was planned. Every movement of the staff was monitored. No one questioned him, and if they did, they were gone the next day. Richard liked this feeling of complete control. It gave him a sense of safety, even if it came at the cost of everyone else's happiness. Despite all this power, Richard was alone. He had no one he truly talked to. He had meetings, parties, and social events, but they were just performances. People smiled at him, but it was fake. They admired his money, not his character. Deep down, he knew that. But he didn't care, or at least he pretended not to. He told himself that emotions were a distraction. Still, sometimes late at night, he sat in his huge office with a glass of whiskey, looking at old photos. There were pictures of him when he was young, before the empire, before the lies. But those moments never lasted long. He would lock the drawer, finish his drink, and return to work. He buried every sign of weakness. Richard had chosen this path long ago, and now it was too late to turn back. He believed love and kindness were for fools, and he had no intention of becoming one. He had everything money could buy, but still, something was missing. Meanwhile, Ethan continued to live like a shadow in his own home. The boy wandered through the halls, played alone in his room, and sometimes sat quietly by the window, watching the world outside. He didn't understand why Richard never smiled at him or talked to him like other fathers did. He only saw the serious face, the loud voice, and the cold eyes. The house, so full of things, felt empty to him. The staff avoided looking at him too long, afraid it might cause trouble. Ethan wasn't a bad child. He just didn't know how to feel loved. Every day was the same. Breakfast alone, playing alone, going to bed alone. He dreamed of running away, but he had nowhere to go. All he knew was this place, and this place had never felt like home. Richard, ruling over everything, never noticed the sadness in Ethan's eyes. He believed everything was fine. He believed he had full control, and he believed no one would ever dare to challenge him. Grace Miller was hired to work as a housekeeper in Richard Coleman's mansion. She was young, quiet, and hard-working. Her main duties were to help clean the large house and also look after Ethan when needed. On her first day, as she walked through the front door, she immediately noticed something was wrong. The place was silent, like no one actually lived there. The staff didn't speak unless necessary, and everyone looked tense. Grace didn't ask many questions. She just nodded, listened, and followed the schedule given to her. Her job included cleaning certain rooms and making sure Ethan was safe when the other staff were busy. She saw the boy for the first time in a hallway, holding a toy car, looking at her with quiet curiosity. He didn't say a word. Grace smiled at him, and he quickly looked away. Even in that small moment, she could see that he wasn't used to kindness. Something about that made her want to protect him. Grace didn't try to force a connection with Ethan. She knew children needed time, but he started showing up more often when she was around. Sometimes he stood near the kitchen door, pretending to look for a snack. Other times, he quietly followed her as she cleaned the living room. Grace never pushed him away. She spoke softly to him, explained what she was doing, and sometimes asked if he wanted to help fold a towel or carry a toy. Ethan would nod or shake his head, but he stayed close. It didn't take long before he began sitting beside her while she worked. He wasn't talkative, but Grace could feel he enjoyed her presence. She never raised her voice, never ignored him, and always answered his questions with patience. Ethan started to smile, just a little, when she entered the room. For the first time in his life, someone was being gentle with him. And Grace, seeing how much the boy needed affection, gave it freely. Richard noticed the change. From his office or the upstairs hallway, he would sometimes see Ethan talking to Grace or handing her a book. He didn't like it. He didn't say anything directly, but his face always tightened when Grace and Ethan were together. Richard preferred control and distance. He believed too much closeness made people weak. He expected staff to do their jobs and nothing more. Grace, however, was being too warm in his eyes. Still, she wasn't breaking any rules. She cleaned, she followed the schedule, and she didn't challenge him. But the way Ethan followed her around bothered him. He had spent years keeping the boy at arm's length, and now someone was getting too close. Richard didn't confront Grace, but the tension grew. Grace felt his eyes on her sometimes, sharp and cold. She knew she had to be careful. This was not a normal home, and Richard was not a normal man. Still, she couldn't ignore the boy. He needed someone, and she was there. As Grace worked around the house, she began to notice odd things. Some doors were always locked, even during the day. One in particular, at the end of a hallway near Richard's office, had 2 locks and a camera pointing right at it. Grace never saw anyone go in or out. Once while dusting the office, she saw papers spread across the desk. She didn't touch anything, but one document had a list of names with numbers next to them. Some names had red marks. Another paper had photos clipped to it, faces she didn't recognize. Before she could look closer, Richard entered, and she stepped back quickly, pretending to clean the shelf. He didn't say anything, but his eyes watched her for a long time before he returned to his chair. Grace left the room quietly. After that, she was more careful. She did her job and stayed quiet, but she didn't forget what she had seen. Something in that house was wrong, and she felt it deeply. Despite the strange atmosphere and Richard's cold attitude, Grace focused on Ethan. Every day, the bond between them grew. She started reading stories to him before bed, if his schedule allowed it. Sometimes they just sat and talked, or he showed her drawings he made. Grace praised him, encouraged him, and always listened. Ethan began to open up slowly. He told her he didn't remember his mother. He said Richard never hugged him. Grace didn't promise anything, but she told him he was important. Her words were simple, but Ethan held on to them. The other staff noticed the change. The boy smiled more. He ate better. He even started drawing pictures of a woman with brown hair, Grace's hair. She was becoming more than just a worker to him. She was the only person who showed him care. Grace never tried to act like a mother, but her presence filled a space that had been empty for too long. In a cold house, she was the only warm light. Grace never stopped being careful. She knew Richard didn't trust her. Sometimes she caught him looking at her through the reflection of a mirror or while walking past the hallway. But she didn't do anything to provoke him. She didn't ask questions or touch anything that wasn't her duty. She focused on cleaning and on Ethan. That alone was enough to keep her going. Ethan needed her, and she couldn't turn her back on that. At night, when the house was quiet, she sometimes thought about leaving. The place was filled with secrets. But then she remembered the boy's smile, or the way he waited by the stairs every morning, hoping she was there. Grace stayed. She didn't know what the future would bring, but she knew her presence was making a difference. Over time, she became the only person in Ethan's life who showed him consistent love. She never said much about it, but her actions were clear. Grace had found a purpose. Ethan had found someone who cared. As the weeks passed, Grace started noticing strange things about how the house worked. The daily routine seemed normal at first. Cleaning schedules, meal times, and quiet evenings, but there were patterns that didn't make sense. Richard spent many late nights locked in his office. Even when the rest of the house was asleep, the light under his office door stayed on. Sometimes she passed by and heard him speaking in a low voice on the phone, always serious and sharp. He didn't want anyone near him during those hours. In the mornings, Grace saw new envelopes on the desk or men delivering sealed packages at the back entrance. These deliveries were never logged or mentioned. The guards or assistants who received them never spoke. It all felt too organized to be random. Grace wasn't sure what was going on, but it didn't feel legal. Something deeper was happening behind closed doors, and the house no longer felt just strict. It was starting to feel dangerous and full of secrets. One afternoon, Grace was cleaning the private elevator that only Richard used. Usually, it was locked. But that day, it was open and unguarded. She didn't hesitate. She stepped in to clean it quickly and noticed something odd in a side compartment. Behind a loose panel was a stack of folders. She pulled out a few and saw they were marked with strange codes and names of companies she had never heard of. The names looked fake, and some had stamps and signatures that seemed off. One document listed large sums of money moving between different accounts. Grace didn't know much about business, but she could tell this wasn't normal. Her heart started beating faster. She took photos of the documents using her phone and carefully put everything back exactly where it was. That night, she printed copies and hid them inside her luggage. She didn't know what she was planning to do, but she wanted proof. Something illegal was going on, and she had just found the first piece. Grace tried to act normal after that, but she couldn't hide her tension completely. She moved more carefully around the house and paid extra attention to Richard's movements. Ethan noticed. He was sharper than most people gave him credit for. One morning, while they were in the kitchen, he asked Grace if something was wrong. She smiled and said everything was fine, but he didn't believe her. Later that day, he asked his father about the company. He didn't ask much, just why people were bringing money or why there were always secret meetings. Richard's reaction was immediate and harsh. He raised his voice and told Ethan never to ask about work again. His tone scared the boy so much that he ran to his room and didn't come out for hours. Grace wanted to comfort him, but she knew Richard would be watching closely now. Things were getting worse. She had crossed a line by looking at those documents, and now even Ethan had gotten pulled into something he didn't understand. Richard was no fool. He didn't show it, but he felt something was off. He was paranoid by nature and trusted no one, especially not new employees. After Ethan's questions, he became suspicious that someone in the house had been talking to the boy. He didn't say anything directly to Grace, but she noticed new behavior. The guards started checking rooms more often. Small devices appeared in corners, hidden cameras. Richard ordered the installation of a new security system, claiming it was for safety. Grace knew it wasn't just about security. It was about control. She began checking every room she entered, every surface she touched. She stopped using her phone inside the house and started keeping the copied documents in a place Richard would never think to look. The feeling of being watched became constant. The mansion, once just cold and strict, now felt like a trap. Grace realized she had to be even more careful. One mistake could lead to everything falling apart, or worse. Each day, the house became heavier with tension. Grace did her work, cleaned every assigned area, and spoke only when necessary. She limited her time in rooms with cameras and stopped asking any questions. She avoided Richard whenever she could. Still, every time she saw Ethan, she felt a small sense of peace. The boy still smiled when he saw her, even if just a little. He trusted her, and that meant everything. When she was with him, she felt brave. He didn't understand the danger around him, and Grace didn't want him to. She protected him as best she could, through small things, keeping him away from Richard when he was angry, making sure he had someone to talk to. But the fear was always there. She had seen too much. She had proof of things Richard wanted hidden, and she knew he would do anything to protect his secrets. But Grace stayed. As long as Ethan was in that house, she wasn't going to leave him alone in it. Every night, Grace checked the documents again, making sure they were still safe. She didn't know if she should show them to someone, but she knew she couldn't let them be destroyed. She was scared, but she had to stay calm. She didn't know what Richard was capable of if he found out what she had done. She stayed out of his way, avoided his office, and kept quiet. But even with all the fear, she still looked forward to seeing Ethan each day. His presence reminded her why she hadn't left yet. His safety was more important than her fear. Even when the house felt like a prison, Ethan's smile gave her strength. She held on to that feeling every day. She told herself to stay focused, to wait for the right moment. Things were getting more dangerous, and she knew the situation was slowly reaching a point where something would have to change. But for now, Grace kept her secret hidden, and she kept Ethan safe. Richard Coleman had finally realized that someone inside his house had taken confidential files from his office. He didn't know how, but he knew it had happened. Important documents were missing, and some digital copies had been accessed at strange times. For days, he stayed up late, checking security footage and phone records, trying to figure out who the traitor was. When he saw Grace cleaning near the private elevator on the day the files were last moved, everything clicked in his mind. He didn't have proof, but he didn't need it. His instinct told him it was her. The idea that a simple housemaid had dared to cross him made him furious. Richard wasn't the kind of man who forgave betrayal. He wanted revenge, but he also wanted it quiet. No police, no noise, no attention. To him, Grace was just another problem that needed to disappear, just like others who had gotten in his way before. He began to plan carefully. Richard knew how to make things look like accidents. He had done it before in business, when he wanted someone removed or silenced. This time, he wanted the same precision. Grace's death had to seem natural, unexpected, and clean. He called one of his trusted technicians, a man who handled the house's elevators and cameras. The conversation happened late at night in his office. Richard's tone was cold and direct. He ordered the technician to adjust the private elevator, the one Grace often used to carry cleaning supplies upstairs. The task was simple: create a mechanical failure that would cause the elevator to drop suddenly. It would be quick, final, and impossible to trace. Richard paid in cash and warned the man never to speak of it again. When the technician left, Richard poured himself a drink, convinced that the problem was about to be solved. In his mind, Grace's fate was already sealed. Over the next few days, Richard acted normally, but there was something colder in his behavior. He didn't speak much to the staff, and his eyes followed Grace every time she walked by. Grace felt that something was wrong. The tension in the house was unbearable, and she noticed small changes. The way the guards whispered, how the technician stayed longer near the elevator than usual. Still, she didn't know the danger she was in. Ethan, meanwhile, was spending more time with her than ever. He helped her clean, asked her questions, and even drew pictures for her. Grace smiled through her fear, pretending everything was fine for the boy's sake. But Ethan had lived in that house long enough to sense when things were wrong. He noticed how his father's mood changed whenever Grace entered the room. Richard's expression grew darker, colder, like he was waiting for something to happen. The boy couldn't explain it, but he knew something bad was coming. One evening, while walking toward his father's office to ask for a book, Ethan stopped when he heard voices. The door was slightly open, and he recognized his father's tone, angry and serious. Richard was talking on the phone, pacing back and forth. Ethan listened quietly. The words were short but terrifying. "It has to be done tomorrow. No mistakes. I want this problem gone." The boy froze. He didn't understand everything, but the way Richard spoke made his stomach twist. He had heard that same tone when his father fired people or punished workers. Ethan didn't know what problem meant, but deep down, he was afraid it was about Grace. His hands started shaking. He backed away from the door before Richard noticed him and ran to his room. That night, he couldn't sleep. He thought about Grace's smile, her patience, the way she made him feel safe. He couldn't imagine losing her, but he was sure his father was planning something terrible. The next morning, the mansion felt different. The air was thick with tension. Grace went about her duties, unaware that her life was in danger. She used the elevator like she always did, carrying cleaning supplies and laundry. Ethan followed her around, more anxious than usual. He didn't know how to tell her what he had heard. If he told the truth, Richard might punish him or hurt her faster. but staying quiet felt worse. During breakfast, Richard watched them both carefully. He spoke calmly, even smiled once, but there was something unnatural about it. Every time Grace walked toward the elevator, Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to say something, but fear kept his mouth closed. The technician arrived again that day under the excuse of checking the new security system. Grace didn't question it. She just nodded politely and continued her work. None of them knew that every movement was leading her closer to a deadly trap, carefully prepared by Richard himself. As the day went on, the silence in the house grew heavier. The staff avoided conversation, sensing that Richard was in one of his moods. Grace continued cleaning, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Ethan followed her until she gently told him to go rest. He didn't want to leave, but she smiled and promised to talk later. When she stepped into the elevator, Ethan stood at the end of the hallway, watching. His heart pounded. He remembered his father's voice, the words about ending the problem, and panic filled his chest. He couldn't stay still. He turned and ran toward the office, hoping to find someone, anyone, to stop it. Down below, Richard sat calmly in his study, waiting for a call from the technician. For him, this was just another task, another loose end to be tied up. The mansion, once silent, now felt alive with tension and fear. Every second felt like it could be the last. The next morning started like any other. Grace woke early, got dressed and prepared her cleaning cart. She had a list of rooms to clean and started with the ones on the upper floor. As always, she used the private elevator to reach that part of the mansion. She walked slowly toward it, holding a bucket and a few cleaning supplies. Nothing seemed different. The hallway was quiet, and the elevator door stood open, waiting. Grace stepped closer. At that exact moment, Ethan came running around the corner, yelling her name. His face was red, and he looked terrified. He screamed for her to stop and not to go inside. She turned, shocked by his voice, and before she could respond, Ethan threw himself in front of the elevator and blocked the entrance with his arms. He was crying, shaking, and shouting that it was a trap. Grace froze. Something in the boy's eyes made her listen. She took a step back, unsure of what was happening. Ethan couldn't stop crying. He kept repeating the same thing. "It's a trap. Don't go inside. He wants to hurt you." Grace was confused, trying to calm him down while looking around, but Ethan didn't let her move. He pulled her away from the door just as the elevator made a strange sound. Then, without warning, the elevator dropped. The doors shook violently and a loud crashing noise echoed through the hall. Grace jumped back, holding Ethan close. A few seconds earlier, and she would have been inside. The cleaning cart, left at the edge, was pulled slightly forward and tipped over. Everything inside spilled onto the floor. Grace stared at the elevator shaft, completely silent, her body frozen. The sound of the impact was still ringing in her ears. She realized what had just happened. It hadn't been a malfunction. It wasn't an accident. If Ethan hadn't stopped her, she would have been dead. She looked down at the boy who was still crying, clutching her tightly. The noise of the crash brought everyone running. The staff came from different parts of the house, looking shocked and confused. The butler, 2 maids, and even the gardener ran into the hallway. Richard arrived last. He looked calm but slightly out of breath, pretending not to know what had happened. He asked questions and acted surprised like everyone else, but something about his face didn't match his words. Grace watched him carefully. She noticed that Ethan refused to look at his father. The boy clung to her and sobbed harder when Richard stepped closer. Grace could feel his body trembling. When one of the maids asked what had happened, Ethan suddenly pointed at Richard and shouted, "He did it! He wanted to hurt her! He made the elevator fall!" Everyone froze. The silence in the hallway was heavy. No one knew what to say. Richard looked around, trying to hide his anger. He forced a concerned expression, but Ethan's tearful voice made it clear. He knew the truth. Some of the workers tried to calm Ethan, thinking he was just frightened and confused. They gently told him that accidents happen, and no one was to blame. But Ethan kept repeating his words, louder each time. "My dad wanted her gone. He told someone to break the elevator." The more he said, the more nervous the staff became. Grace stood beside him, still shaken, not saying anything yet. She looked at Richard and saw the cold look in his eyes, just for a second. He quickly replaced it with fake concern, kneeling beside Ethan and saying he would get to the bottom of this. But Grace didn't believe it. She remembered the strange behavior in the last few days, the technician's visit, and the way Richard had watched her. The pieces were falling into place. Ethan hadn't misunderstood anything. He had saved her life. Grace felt a cold fear settling inside her. If Richard had planned this once, he could try again, and next time she might not be so lucky. Grace held Ethan's hand tightly as the elevator area was blocked off and workers were sent away. Richard told the staff that everything would be investigated. He said they would call the elevator company and get a full report, but Grace wasn't listening to his words anymore. Her mind was elsewhere. She kept thinking about how close she had come to dying. She had trusted the routine, trusted the house. Now she realized nothing was safe. The man who ran the house, the man who paid her, had tried to kill her and had almost succeeded. She looked at Ethan, still crying beside her, and felt both fear and gratitude. He had risked everything to stop her from stepping inside. Somehow, even at his young age, he had known the danger was real. Grace no longer had any doubts. This wasn't just a bad place, it was a dangerous one. She couldn't let her guard down again. And most of all, she couldn't let Ethan be alone in it. When the crowd finally began to break apart and things calmed down, Grace took Ethan to his room and sat with him until he stopped crying. She asked him gently how he knew about the elevator, and he told her everything. He said he had heard Richard speaking on the phone the night before, talking about getting rid of the problem. He said he just knew that the problem was her. Grace believed every word. She didn't know what she would do next, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't trust Richard, and she couldn't leave Ethan unprotected. That day changed everything for her. She was no longer just a housekeeper. She was now part of something much bigger, something dangerous. And she had a choice to make. But at that moment, all she could do was sit beside Ethan, holding his hand, silently thanking him for saving her life. She didn't show it on her face, but inside she was more afraid than ever before. In the days that followed the elevator incident, Grace acted like nothing had happened. She continued her tasks, followed her schedule, and spoke politely to everyone. On the outside, she looked calm, but inside she was alert and cautious. Every step she took inside the mansion now felt dangerous. She avoided using the elevator completely and paid attention to every word Richard said. When she was alone, she began to search for answers. She checked old devices, looked through drawers, and carefully reviewed the office computer when it was left unlocked. After several attempts, she found a folder of messages between Richard and the elevator technician. The texts were short but clear. They discussed technical adjustments, specific times, and payment. It confirmed what she feared. The elevator had been sabotaged on purpose. Grace copied the messages to a pen drive and hid it in her bag. That night, she showed it to Ethan in secret. She told him not to tell anyone, especially Richard. The boy nodded, understanding the danger. Ethan listened quietly as Grace explained what she had found. He asked simple questions, trying to understand why someone would do such a thing. Grace explained gently that some people do terrible things to protect their secrets. She told him that what she showed him had to stay between them. If anyone found out, they could both be in danger. Ethan looked scared, but promised not to say a word. After that moment, something changed between them. They trusted each other more than ever before, but not everyone was blind to their closeness. Richard had been watching. He noticed how Ethan always sat near Grace, how they whispered sometimes in the hallway, and how Grace had been walking around certain parts of the mansion more than usual. He didn't have proof, but his suspicion grew stronger. Richard didn't like when people kept things from him. He had already failed once with the elevator plan. Now he wanted to get rid of Grace in a different way, one that wouldn't risk failure. One morning, without warning, Richard called the police to the mansion. He claimed that Grace had stolen private documents from his office and had used the company computer without permission. When the officers arrived, they found her in the kitchen. She was surprised but stayed calm. They asked her to follow them to a private room for questioning. Richard stood nearby, acting serious and disappointed. The staff watched from a distance, whispering. Grace sat down with the officers and answered all their questions. She said she had never touched anything personal, never stolen anything, and didn't know what they were talking about. She kept her voice steady and tried to remain confident, but the police had only heard Richard's side, and his power and name carried weight. They didn't believe her. They asked to check her phone and bag, but she had already hidden the pen drive somewhere safe the night before. After a long talk, the officers said they would continue the investigation. For now, she was suspended from work. Grace was told to leave the mansion immediately. She wasn't allowed to say goodbye to the staff or to Ethan. 2 guards followed her to her room, watched as she packed a few things, and then walked her to the front gate. Ethan found out too late. When he ran to find her, she was already outside talking to the driver. He shouted her name, but a guard blocked his path. "She didn't do anything," he cried. "You're all wrong." But no one listened. Richard stood in the hallway, arms crossed, showing no emotion. Grace looked back one last time and saw Ethan's face at the window, his eyes full of tears. She waved quickly, trying to stay strong. It broke her heart to leave him behind, especially knowing what kind of man Richard really was. But she didn't panic. She knew she couldn't protect Ethan from the outside, not yet. First, she had to finish what she had started. She had to prove the truth and expose Richard for who he really was. Outside the mansion, Grace stayed quiet and careful. She didn't go back to her apartment. Instead, she contacted an old employee from Richard's company, a man who had left months ago under strange conditions. They met at a quiet cafe far from the city center. She told him everything that had happened, and to her surprise, he wasn't shocked. He said he had seen things too, but never had the courage to speak up. He agreed to help. He had access to old records, emails, and transaction logs. Together, they began to collect more proof. Every night, Grace went through files and screenshots. The more she saw, the clearer it became. Richard had built his empire on lies, threats, and illegal deals. She kept every file safe and backed up everything twice. She didn't know how long it would take, but she was sure now. She wasn't just going to prove her innocence. She was going to bring Richard down. For herself, for Ethan, and for everyone who had ever been hurt by him. Ethan, still stuck inside the mansion, didn't forget Grace. He missed her every day. He didn't trust anyone else, not even the maids or tutors. He tried to ask about her, but everyone avoided the topic. Richard warned him not to speak of her again. But the boy remembered her words. "Don't tell anyone. Be careful." He tried to act normal, but he was always listening, always watching. Meanwhile, Grace continued gathering proof. She stayed quiet, worked in the background, and never stopped. Her mind was clear. She had been targeted, removed, and accused, but she wasn't going to disappear. She had too much to fight for. Even if no one believed her now, the truth was on her side. She kept working with the ex-employee, double-checking every file and preparing her next move. No matter how powerful Richard was, Grace wasn't afraid anymore. She had faced death, false accusations, and heartbreak. Now she had a mission, and she wasn't going to stop until the world saw who Richard really was. During her investigation, Grace continued digging through every document, email, and folder the former employee could give her access to. Most of the files focused on financial crimes, false contracts, money transfers, and shell companies. But one night, she opened a folder named Family Records. It seemed unrelated at first, but inside, she found something that stopped her completely. Among scanned files and scanned papers, there was one document that confirmed something horrible. Ethan had been adopted illegally. The paper had the name of a closed orphanage, and next to it, there were signatures that looked forged. Grace's hands started shaking. The files showed proof that Richard had paid large sums of money to keep everything quiet. He had erased Ethan's original identity and replaced it with fake records that showed Richard as his biological father. There were payment slips, a letter from the orphanage's director, and emails between lawyers. Everything was real. Grace now understood that Ethan hadn't just been mistreated. He had been used since the beginning. Grace felt sick to her stomach. The more she read, the worse it got. It became clear that Richard hadn't adopted Ethan out of love. He had used the boy to build a fake image of himself, a man with a heart, a family man who people could trust. This image helped him avoid deep investigations, dodge tax audits, and win sympathy from investors. Grace couldn't believe how cold and calculated Richard had been. Ethan had been nothing more than a tool to him. Grace felt anger, sadness, and guilt all at once. She had known Richard was cruel, but she hadn't imagined it went this far. For a long time, she sat staring at the documents. Then she printed them, saved them to her backup drive, and took a deep breath. She knew what she had to do. It wasn't just about proving Richard was corrupt anymore. It was about protecting Ethan fully, forever. He had no one else. He deserved to know the truth, even if it would break his heart. The next day, Grace returned to the neighborhood near the mansion. She didn't go inside, but waited near Ethan's school. When she saw him leaving with his driver, she found a way to pass him a note without being noticed. The note told him to meet her at a nearby park after lunch. That afternoon, when he arrived, his face lit up when he saw her, but his smile faded when he saw her serious expression. They sat on a bench under a tree, and Grace carefully explained what she had found. She showed him the documents. At first, Ethan didn't understand. He looked at the papers, confused. Then, little by little, the truth sank in. His eyes filled with tears. He started asking questions Grace didn't know how to answer. He asked why Richard had lied, why the orphanage gave him away, and if any of it had been real. Grace could only hold him and repeat that none of it was his fault. He cried in her arms, heartbroken. Ethan didn't stop crying for a long time. He hugged Grace tightly, not letting go. Through his tears, he kept saying, "I don't want to go back. Please don't leave me again." Grace held him close and promised, "I won't. I'll never leave you again." In that moment, Ethan began calling her Mom. It wasn't forced. It came naturally, like something he had always wanted to say, but never could before. Grace felt her own tears fall, but she stayed strong. She had to. Ethan needed her more than ever. For the first time, they both understood that their bond was no longer just emotional. It was real, like family. Grace wiped his face and told him that things were going to change. She told him she was gathering everything they needed to stop Richard. Ethan asked what would happen to him. Grace promised that she would find a way to keep him safe no matter what. She wasn't just protecting him anymore. She was fighting for him like a real mother. That night, Grace returned to her small apartment, locked the door, and spread out all the evidence across the table. She had proof of the elevator sabotage, the false adoption, financial fraud, and years of corruption. Every piece was organized, labeled, and saved on digital backups. She didn't sleep. She worked all night, building a file strong enough to take Richard down. In the morning, she contacted a lawyer who had helped whistleblowers before. They scheduled a meeting. She didn't share everything yet, but the lawyer agreed to help her prepare the material for the authorities. Grace knew that going to the police wouldn't be enough. Richard had contacts everywhere. She needed to go higher, to people who couldn't be bought. She also wrote a letter explaining Ethan's situation in case anything happened to her. She was tired, but for the first time she felt stronger than Richard. She had the truth, he had lies, and now she had someone to protect who meant more than anything, Ethan. In the days that followed, Grace avoided any contact with the mansion. She stayed away, knowing that Richard was likely watching everything. But she stayed in touch with Ethan through short, hidden messages. He told her that things inside the house were tense. Richard acted colder than ever and had no idea that Ethan already knew the truth. The boy followed Grace's instructions. He kept quiet, listened carefully, and avoided conversations that might expose them. Grace continued meeting with the lawyer and preparing the final report. She knew she couldn't delay much longer. Richard still had power, but now she had something stronger: evidence, witnesses, motive. She had survived his attack. She had uncovered his secrets, and now she was ready to reveal everything. Grace wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't just cleaning rooms or surviving in silence. She was going to speak up, and when she did, everything Richard had built would collapse. For the first time, she had more power than he could imagine, and she was ready to use it. Richard had finally found out that Grace had not given up. Somehow, even after being removed from the mansion and falsely accused, she was still active. She had gathered documents, contacted lawyers, and was planning something big. Richard was furious. He felt threatened, cornered. He didn't care how, but he wanted her stopped, this time for good. He gave an order to his private security team: locate Grace and finish the job. He told them to go to the apartment where she was believed to be hiding with Ethan. His plan was to send a message: anyone who went against him would pay. That same night, 2 security men were sent to break into the apartment. But when they arrived, Grace and Ethan were already gone. The place was empty, no sign of them. Richard didn't know that Grace had anticipated this. She had moved out days earlier, staying in a safe place provided by the lawyer. By the time his men failed, it was already too late for Richard. That same afternoon, while Richard was still trying to understand what went wrong, something happened that would change everything. News channels began airing a breaking story. Reporters on television showed documents, emails, and even video recordings. They exposed a series of crimes involving Richard Coleman: financial fraud, illegal adoption, threats, and attempted murder. Images of the forged adoption documents and audio clips of conversations with the elevator technician were shown on national television. The news spread fast. In a matter of hours, Richard's name was everywhere. Business partners backed away. Stocks tied to his companies dropped sharply. People who once praised him now refused to be associated with him. Inside the mansion, Richard panicked. He tried calling his lawyers, but no one answered. He knew what was coming. He gathered money, fake IDs, and a forged passport he had prepared for emergencies. His plan was to leave the country before the police arrived. He didn't care about anything else anymore. His only goal was escape. But the authorities were already ahead of him. Acting on the evidence provided anonymously by Grace's legal team, a judge approved immediate action. Police surrounded the mansion early in the evening. Black vehicles pulled up at the gates. Officers in uniform entered the property with search warrants. No one was allowed to leave. They seized computers, hard drives, phones, and documents from every room. Richard tried to escape through a side entrance, holding a small suitcase with money and his fake passport, but he didn't get far. 2 officers tackled him near the garage and arrested him on the spot. He yelled, denied everything, and accused everyone of lying, but no one listened. Cameras captured the moment. The image of the once powerful billionaire being handcuffed quickly made its way to social media. Inside the mansion, some staff members cried. Others watched in silence. Richard Coleman, feared and respected for years, was finally being brought down. And the whole country was watching as it happened in real time. While Richard was being taken away, social workers entered the mansion with clear instructions. Their job was to locate Ethan and ensure his safety. They found him in one of the upstairs rooms with 2 maids. He didn't resist. He had been waiting for this moment, just as Grace had told him. The social workers explained that everything was okay, that he was safe now, and that he would be taken to a protected place. Ethan nodded. He didn't speak much, but he held a small drawing in his hand, one he had made of Grace. As they drove away from the mansion, Ethan looked out the window without saying a word. He wasn't scared anymore. He felt relieved. For the first time, he wasn't surrounded by fear or silence. Somewhere out there, Grace was waiting, and he trusted her completely. She had promised that he would never be alone again, and she had kept that promise even when everything seemed impossible. At the police station, Grace arrived with everything she had. The pen drive was full of organized evidence, folders with documents, voice recordings, and emails. She also brought written testimonies from ex-employees who had worked under Richard and were finally willing to speak. She sat in a small room with 2 detectives and laid everything out. She told the full story, step by step: the illegal adoption, the elevator sabotage, the threats, the false accusations. She explained how Richard had tried to silence her and how Ethan had saved her life. The officers listened carefully, took notes, and copied everything she provided. There was no doubt left. The evidence was clear, undeniable. Grace didn't cry or raise her voice. She stayed calm, focused, and answered every question. She had waited for this moment for so long, and now it was finally happening. Before leaving, one of the officers thanked her. He said that without her, none of this would have been possible. Grace nodded. She wasn't looking for thanks, only justice. Within 24 hours, the media exploded. Every newspaper, TV station, and website covered the case. The truth about Richard Coleman was out. Headlines called him the billionaire fraud, the man behind the mask, and the empire of lies. Videos of his arrest were replayed constantly. The public reacted with shock and anger. People who once admired him now called for his punishment. Former victims came forward, confirming Grace's story. Social media was flooded with comments supporting her bravery and asking for justice for Ethan. Richard faced multiple charges: corruption, illegal adoption, attempted murder, tax fraud, and obstruction of justice. In a short time, the man who had once controlled everything was locked in a prison cell, awaiting trial. He was no longer feared. He was hated. His power, his money, and his name meant nothing now. Meanwhile, Grace remained quiet, avoiding the spotlight. She had done what she needed to do. The empire Richard had built was gone, and this time there was no escape. The trial of Richard Coleman became the most talked about event of the year. Every news outlet in the country followed the case closely. People gathered around their televisions and phones to watch the updates. Reporters stood outside the courthouse each day, waiting for new information. Cameras captured Richard being escorted in and out of the courtroom in handcuffs, no longer the powerful man he used to be. Inside, the courtroom was full. Journalists, former employees, victims, and even curious citizens came to witness the fall of one of the country's most feared businessmen. Security was tight, and each session brought more shocking revelations. Grace sat with her lawyer every day, calm but focused. Ethan was kept away from the press, under protection. As the trial continued, it became clear that this wasn't just about one crime. It was about years of lies, abuse of power, and manipulation. What Richard had built over decades was now being taken apart, piece by piece, in front of the entire nation. One by one, former business partners and accomplices stepped forward. Many of them had worked with Richard for years. Some had signed fake documents for him. Others had helped him move money through fake companies. Most were afraid to speak at first, but after seeing the evidence Grace had provided, they decided to cooperate in exchange for lighter sentences. Their testimonies confirmed everything: fraud, sabotage, illegal adoption, and threats. Each witness added another piece to the puzzle. One former executive even admitted he had been paid monthly just to keep quiet. The judge listened carefully, writing notes and asking direct questions. The court was silent as these confessions came out. The damage Richard had caused wasn't only financial, it had ruined lives. And now those stories were finally being told. The people who once stood beside him were now against him, trying to protect themselves. Their confessions made the case stronger. Richard sat quietly at the defense table, hearing everything, knowing his empire was collapsing in front of him. When Grace took the stand, the room grew completely silent. She stood up, walked to the front, and faced the court without hesitation. Her voice was steady as she spoke about the sabotage of the elevator, the threats she received, and how Richard tried to get rid of her to protect his secrets. She told them how she found the documents that proved Ethan's adoption was illegal and how she had to run and hide to protect herself and the boy. She also described Ethan's pain, how the child had been used and lied to for years. People in the courtroom were moved. Some wiped away tears. Reporters wrote quickly, capturing every word. Grace didn't ask for pity. She told the truth so that justice could be served. Her courage made a strong impact. The judge thanked her at the end of her statement. Everyone in that room understood that she wasn't just a witness. She was the reason Richard had finally been stopped. The verdict came after weeks of hearings. The judge reviewed every file, testimony, and recording. Then came the final decision. Richard Coleman was found guilty on all counts. The list of crimes was long: corruption, fraud, attempted murder, illegal adoption, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to decades in prison. There would be no chance of parole for a long time. The court also ruled that his properties and financial assets would be seized. Richard showed no emotion when the sentence was read, but to the public it was a moment of victory. For years, he had acted untouchable. Now justice had proven otherwise. Grace held Ethan's hand outside the courthouse as reporters gathered. She didn't make a speech. She simply said, "It's over," and that was enough. For the first time in a long time, she felt peace. Richard, the man who had caused so much fear and pain, was gone. The law had done its job, and no amount of money or power had been able to stop it. After the trial, the government took control of Richard's estate. His companies were shut down, and bank accounts were frozen. A large portion of the recovered money was used to help people who had been harmed by his actions. Former employees, investors who had been tricked, and others who had lost everything due to Richard's scams received part of the compensation. Grace and Ethan were also included. They were given financial reparation for the suffering they had endured. It wasn't just about the money. It was recognition of everything they had gone through. Grace used the funds to rebuild a stable life for them both. She made sure Ethan had access to a good school, therapy, and everything he needed to heal. Meanwhile, the mansion where everything had happened was put up for auction. People came from all over to see it. Eventually, it was sold. The building that once represented fear and lies was no longer Richard's. His legacy was finished, replaced by the truth and consequences of his actions. As the dust settled, the country reflected on what had happened. The fall of Richard Coleman wasn't just the downfall of a man, it was the end of a corrupt legacy. For years, he had used money and influence to control everything around him. But in the end, it didn't save him. The trial proved that power is not above the law. Grace became a symbol of strength. People admired her bravery, her patience, and her refusal to stay silent. Ethan, once a forgotten child in a cold mansion, now had a future. The court had given him legal protection, and Grace was officially named his guardian. The two of them started a new life together, free from fear. They didn't talk much about the past. They focused on building something better. The mansion, the lies, and Richard were all behind them now. The justice system had done its part. What once seemed impossible had happened. Power had fallen, and truth had finally won. Months had passed since the trial ended, and Richard Coleman was sent to prison. Life had changed completely for Grace and Ethan. They no longer lived in fear. They now lived in a small, peaceful house in the countryside. It wasn't big or fancy, but it was clean, quiet, and full of warmth. Grace had chosen the place carefully. She didn't want anything that reminded them of the past. The house had a garden, a wooden fence, and 2 small bedrooms, one for her and one for Ethan. Every morning they followed a new routine. Grace made breakfast, and Ethan got ready for school. He had new clothes, school supplies, and a backpack he loved. He walked to school with other kids from the area and came home with stories and drawings. His laughter filled the house, something that had once been missing from his life. He no longer had nightmares. He no longer avoided hugs. He proudly called Grace Mom, and she responded with love every time. Grace had used part of the compensation money from the trial to start something important. With the help of her lawyer and a few volunteers, she opened a small institution in the nearby town. It was a shelter for children, those who had been abandoned, abused, or left without protection. She called it New Beginnings. The building was modest, but it had everything the children needed: beds, food, school support, and safety. Grace visited often, helped organize activities, and listened to every child's story with care. She knew what it meant to feel alone and unwanted, and she wanted no child to ever feel that again. The staff was trained not just to care for the children, but to treat them with respect. Slowly, the shelter began to receive support from others in the community. Donations came in, people volunteered, and local schools offered to help. What started as a small dream became something bigger. Grace wasn't doing it for attention. She was doing it because it mattered. News of what Grace had done spread. Reporters covered her story, but this time the spotlight was different. They talked about her strength, her fight for justice, and how she had turned pain into purpose. Articles called her a voice for the voiceless and a mother by choice, not by blood. People from across the country wrote letters of support. Some shared similar experiences, thanking her for being brave. Others offered help, wanting to be part of the change. Grace didn't let fame distract her. She kept her life simple and focused on Ethan. But deep down, she was proud, not of the recognition, but of what she had overcome. The woman who once worked in silence, cleaning rooms and hiding from danger, was now a symbol of hope. And Ethan, once used as a cover for someone's crimes, was now growing in a world full of love, free to be a child. Their story had inspired people, and their future looked nothing like their past. Ethan's days were now filled with peace. He had friends at school, played soccer on the weekends, and spent his afternoons doing homework or reading. Grace helped him with his studies and always asked about his day. Sometimes they cooked together or planted flowers in the garden. At night, they watched movies and shared snacks on the couch. Ethan smiled more. He laughed without holding back. The shadows from his past slowly faded. He still remembered the mansion, the silence, and the fear, but they no longer controlled him. Whenever he had a bad dream, Grace was there. She listened, comforted him, and reminded him he was safe now. He had a room filled with drawings and books. On one wall, he had framed a picture he drew of himself and Grace holding hands. He had written, "My real family." That picture meant more to Grace than anything else. She had once fought just to survive. Now, she had something to protect and someone who loved her deeply. The mansion where Richard once lived remained empty. After the trial, no one wanted to buy it. People said it carried too many bad memories. The large rooms stood untouched, the windows covered in dust and the halls silent. It became a symbol of everything that went wrong, a place built on lies, fear, and greed. No one walked near it. Tourists sometimes passed by, curious to see where it all happened, but most locals avoided it. It stood like a warning that power without conscience always ends in ruin. Grace sometimes thought about that house. She didn't feel hate anymore, only sadness. It reminded her of how far they had come. She didn't speak about it to Ethan unless he asked. The mansion no longer had control over their lives. It was just a building, frozen in time. Their world had moved forward, far from that place. Grace had no interest in the past now. Her focus was on what she had built, with love, effort, and truth. Every morning, Grace stood outside her house for a few minutes before starting her day. She looked at the sky, breathed deeply, and felt grateful. Life wasn't perfect, but it was honest. It was full of real choices and real peace. She had no maids, no drivers, no guards. But she had something much better: freedom, a loving son, and a home filled with truth. Ethan came outside and stood beside her, usually carrying his backpack, smiling. "Ready, Mum?" he'd ask, and she would nod. They walked together toward the school bus, hand in hand. Grace no longer feared the future. She had faced everything she thought she couldn't and had come out stronger. She had helped others. She had rebuilt herself. She had raised a boy who now felt safe, loved, and proud. As she looked toward the horizon, she believed something deeply. No matter how dark the past may be, good always finds a way. Even after the worst storms, there is always a chance to begin again. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.